Hello and welcome to another Blender tutorial. Today we are going to be talking about rendering and saving the image file. So what we're going to do first is select our GPU or CPU that we want to use for processing our image. So I'm going to go over to Edit, then to Preferences, and then let me just make this a little bigger so it's easier to see. What I want to do is go over to System, and as you see here, you'll see Cycles Render Devices. So we're going to be using cycles to render this image here, and basically what you want to do is try to select these and see which one has which one pops up as having a CPU or GPU. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm using a RTX 2070 Super. So I'm going to be using CUDA for my rendering. And basically that just all it means is that's what we're going to be rendering with. And I selected my GPU or graphics processing unit. I did not select my CPU because apparently for me, if I were to use my CPU and GPU, it actually ends up being slower. So later, once you understand rendering and how to do that process, you're going to want to maybe go back and try adding on your CPU. Now, if nothing appears here in CUDA or optics, then that might mean that you might not have a pretty um, a GPU that is able to render pretty quickly. So hopefully you might see yours in OpenCL, and depending on how good your GPU is, you might want to just render with your CPU. And we'll get to all of this later on. Just long story short, try to go through CUDA, Optics, or OpenCL and select your GPU if you have one. So now I'm going to go back. I'm going to press Render Properties here. Now what this is its render engine. It is set to Eevee. If I were to press this here, which is Viewport, which is a mode for viewport shading, I can now see the shadows and some of the reflection effects. Now for Eevee, it's kind of a real-time rendering, but as you see, it's not the best. It's not completely accurate, so I'm going to be using cycles, and as you see here, it looks much more precise, but also you see as I move this around, it gets very blurry. That's because it is trying to calculate all of the light paths, so it takes a moment. So over here, under Device, you can press this, and you can either do CPU or GPU compute. If GPU compute is grayed out, if it looks gray, then I would recommend trying and render on your CPU, because that means that either you did not select your GPU or you do not have a GPU. But for me, I'm going to set it to my GPU. And now, as you see, we're rendering much faster than on my CPU. However, your CPU might be better than your GPU. It just takes some experiments to render it with the GPU and then render with the CPU and see which one goes by faster. And then next we will have sampling. So as you see here, we have render samples and viewport samples. Now, basically that's just how many calculations it'll do. So if I move this up, you'll notice that everything starts to get a little clearer. It's not as noisy. So basically, it just clears everything up. We're just going to stick with the default 128 samples. That'll be enough for a pretty good looking, uh, pretty decent looking image, but also you don't want to stress your computer too much if you have a low-end device. Now what we're going to do next is tap on Performance, and we're going to go down to Tiles. Now this is basically how much of an area your computer will calculate at once. So what we're going to do is we're going to set tiles X and Y to 128. It's just a pretty good size tile size. And it'll do the job pretty well. For things that have a whole lot of objects, you will want to do more of 500 samples, but for now 128 will be enough, because if we were to use the 500 samples, it would actually be less efficient. So now we're going to go back down to light paths, and just basically how many times a light particle can bounce. And we're going to bring the transmission down, transparency down, glossy down 1, and total down to about 8 or 9. And that should speed up your rendering, and it will still basically look the same. Now, basically, we just eliminated how many times a light particle can bounce. So it will, if you were to bring, let's say, transmission down, as you see, our cups are going to be completely black. But if we were to bring it up, you can't really see a difference between 1, 2, you can see a bit of a difference. Well, you can see through it. 3, I'm gonna do 4 because that's pretty good. It's very low, so it's not going to take too long to render. So next what we're going to do is go over to our output properties, and this is basically when the animation starts, the animation ends, and the frames. Will get onto that in a later episode. And here is output. You can select where you want to output the file, what the file is going to be, but we're not going to worry about this right now. What we're actually going to do is just go ahead and press render and press render image. Now as you see here, we have successfully rendered the image, but if you were to look here closely, it is very noisy. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to Compositing. So now we're going to press Use Node or Use Nodes, and you might see this is pretty familiar. You might be familiar with this because it's very similar to the shading. I'm just going to use Shift A and search for Viewer. Here we go. Now we're just going to take the image node to the image, and now as you see, we have our complete image as the background, and you can still see it's noisy. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A, search. I'm going to type in denoise. So I'm going to put it right here. And there we go. Our image looks much nicer now. I'm just going to make sure that this output also goes to composite, so that way when we save the image, this is what we're going to be seeing. And then next, what we will do is we are going to grab this right here, and as you see, it already updated to the composited image, and we're just going to press image, save as. You can save that wherever you want, your render file. You can go ahead and name that. Going to select this and name it first image, and you can just save as image, and there you go, you have saved it. And that is your first render. And if you wanted to add a ground or something, it's pretty simple. I'm just going to press Shift A and I pressed plane. I'm going to bring this down, bring it over, and a little over here. And we got a little floor so we can see those shadows. And what I'm going to do is go into edit mode, tap this edge using edge select, and just press E and then Z to pull it up so we can have like a little backdrop. And I'm also going to go into the modifier tab, press add modifier, and we're going to use Subdivision Surface, and this basically is going to average out kind of the average out the vertices and create new vertices there. And I'm going to set the render in viewport to 3 so it's smoothed out. And then I'm going to go into edit mode, and as you see we can still actually form this even though we don't have to get these individual vertices that you might see here. And this is because the modifier is not applied yet. So I'm just going to press Ctrl R to make a loop cut. I'm just going to move this closer to the edge like so. And what we're doing there is basically it's going to average the distance between these vertices now instead of these vertices. So it's now we have more of a flat surface. So then I'm just going to add a loop cut and move it all the way to the side here and here, and then do the same for these edges, move it all the way to the side, and now we have a pretty nice background. I'm going to right click and then press shade smooth. Now let me just exit out of rendered view. You can go back by pressing this in case it was taking a little long for you to render. You don't want to try editing things in that mode. But anyways, what we have basically here is you can see these vertices or edges, and we're just going to press shade smooth, and that smooths it out basically. And you can go ahead and apply that modifier, and as you see we have all of our vertices here, and that's good. So if you didn't like the angle or you couldn't get the entire object when you were rendering, that's because of this camera. So you can just go ahead and press this camera icon, and I'm going to move out this right here, and I'm going to press view, and I'm going to lock camera to view. So now wherever I look, the camera will follow, and that's pretty good right there. Maybe a little outwards, and I'm just going to disable that so I can look away, and basically anything inside this box is going to be what you see. And we can see some of this void area, so I'm just going to scale it on the y-axis, and we can't see that anymore. And now we can press render and render the image, and now it looks much nicer. And we don't have to composite this all over again because it is actually just going to use the compositing nodes that we already placed. And there we go. We have a very nice looking render. And if you want to make it brighter or darker, you can go here and then press light and then make it brighter and darker, and basically just tweak the lighting, move the lighting around. And a cool tip here is to actually, when you're trying to figure out lighting, you can actually swap over to Eevee, so you can get kind of a very quick estimate of what it's going to look like. So that looks good. And I go into cycles, and now we can get that photorealistic rendering, and it looks pretty neat. So that's all for this tutorial, and next we're going to get a start on making our robot. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.